I'm Molly, and I'm the People Engagement Officer for Species on the Edge. And I'm also working alongside Tom, who's the project officer. Some of you who are in Shetland may already know of Tom, who was previously the assistant warden with the RSPB, and he was based up in Fetler. He's now moved into the project officer role with me. And then we've already heard obviously about Nassie's involvement too, about really sort of getting the project through the development stage. So on this side, there's just a little teaser of the 8 priority species on Shetland, but I'll take you through them all in a bit more detail as we go through the presentation. And I'm just going to introduce you to the programme, take you through all the species, and just tell you a little bit about everything that we have planned here in Shetland for the next 4 years or so. So this slide is really just to say why Species on the Edge. So the programme has chosen 37 different target species across the 7 programme areas, as Rabina mentioned. And you'll see in a later slide, there's a map, and it really shows clearly that these are all areas that are on the edge. They're the coast and the islands of Scotland. And these areas are some of the most biodiverse in the UK, and they are a bit of a stronghold for some really beautiful, unusual, but also unfortunately quite vulnerable species. And these make up our target species, like this gorgeous redneck phalarope. So the target species in the target areas were chosen because they have uncertain futures and they're sliding towards the edge. But the specialist organisations that have made up and created Species on the Edge have chosen the target areas and their species because they really believe that conservation action in these areas can have a big impact and help to bring them back from the precipice. I'll just say a little bit about the sort of the state of Scotland's biodiversity in general. So nature is in crisis, and unfortunately this is something that is pretty much common knowledge nowadays. So there was this report, the State of Nature report, which came out in 2019. And this was put together by professionals from, I think it was 70 different wildlife organisations, as well as government agencies. And they basically drew on all of the best available data to give a really accurate and insightful picture of the status of species across Scotland. The headline really is that unfortunately the abundance and the distribution of Scotland's species has been overall declining over recent decades, and the most up-to-date data is showing that this is unfortunately persisting into the most recent decades as well. So there's not been any let-up really in the net loss of nature for Scotland. There's just a few extracts from the report here. So we can see that over the past 10 years, more species have seen their populations decrease than increase. Since the 1970s, 33% of species are now found in fewer places, and 11% of the species that are seen as threatened in Scotland are actually also threatened with extinction from the UK. So this is all pretty harrowing stuff. But the state of nature isn't just doom and gloom. It's also a showcase of some really exciting conservation initiatives and of the passion and creativity and hard work of individuals and organisations that are really trying to see nature thrive. And we hope that that Species on the Edge rather, can be a bit of a catalyst to focus action to halt biodiversity loss and to bring back these species from the edge. So what is Species on the Edge is a good question. And it's a partnership, which is quite important, and it's a partnership programme. So it's made up of, well, first of all, Nature Scot. So Nature Scot is the lead public body that advises the Scottish Government on all matters relating to natural heritage. But it's also involving 7 other nature conservation organisations, including the RSPB Scotland. But there's also the Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, Bat Conservation Trust, Bug Life, Bumblebee Conservation Trust, Plant Life, and also Butterfly Conservation. The programme has been funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and it wouldn't be possible without the generosity of National Lottery players. And basically, we are all going to be working together so that we can be more than the sum of our parts. We're looking to share our knowledge, our skills and resources, to learn from each other and sort of combine strengths over the next 4 years. We're trying to create a shared vision and to take action for the 37 priority species across Scotland's islands and coasts, and hopefully deliver benefits for people and for nature. It would all basically be for nothing, however, without the participation of local communities and local organisations as well in each of the programme areas. So we really need to work together to pull our species back from the edge, and we're hoping that the programme can help to sort of bring together and galvanise local communities, but also wider communities of interest across the programme areas to sort of redefine their futures and create a lasting and meaningful legacy for the programme. So working together, as I've said, with organisations, both national and local, and then with local communities, we have a vision for Species on the Edge to secure and to improve the future of coastal and island species across Scotland, including here in Shetland. We're looking to form a network between communities to build resilience and momentum to safeguard valuable and vulnerable biodiversity and benefit people and nature. We really understand the importance of partnership working, and we kind of want to embed that as business as usual for the conservation sector in Scotland. And we also are looking to raise awareness of the importance of biodiversity. And I feel like that probably goes without saying for everyone here today. Obviously, we all appreciate Shetland's natural heritage for its own sake, but also it obviously supports and explains an awful lot of the cultural heritage that we all love and appreciate Shetland for as well. Oh, gone the wrong way. 1 second. There we go, that's better. So I think I mentioned this map previously, so this just shows our programme areas, and they are all on the edge. They're the coast and islands of Scotland, and they host some of the rarest and the most threatened species in Scotland, but they also have heaps of potential for improving the future for these species. I'll just quickly take you through the different areas and the different leads. So there's the Argyll and Inner Hebrides, where RSPB Scotland are taking the lead. On the east coast, we've got Butterfly Conservation leading. Plant Life is leading on the north coast. On Orkney, we have RSPB Scotland again. The Outer Hebrides are being looked after by the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. Here in Shetland, the lead partner is RSPB Scotland, and on Solway, it's the Amphibian and Reptile Conservation. So we will be working together and in partnership, and we're looking to be connecting different communities of interest across the programme areas. But every area does have its own unique plan of action, and this reflects that each area has its own unique suite of species, biodiversity, geography, and its own socioeconomic and cultural challenges, but also opportunities that are unique to each area. So just focusing in on Shetland, here's our 8 priority species again. So I'll just quickly whiz through what we have. And we have the plantain leaf beetle, we've got twite, lapwing, the Shetland bumblebee, redneck phalarope, oyster plant, hawkweeds and curlew. And I'll just go through all of these in just a bit more detail with you. Oh, if I can go the right way again. Here we go. So first of all, we've got the curlew, and this is otherwise known as wap here in Shetland, or in fact, it's actually known as the stock wap. So the famous naturalist Jessie Saxby from Unst tells us that the word stock that is applied to any creature or thing that is the largest of its category. So an example would be Stockholm, which is the largest of a group of islands. And it's also the name of the capital of Sweden, which I'm sure we all know recently absolutely robbed Finland at the Eurovision. But for the curlew, it means that the Eurasian curlew is stock wap because it's the largest curlew species in Europe, and it's actually the largest wader in Europe as well. So the UK has an internationally important population of breeding curlew. It's thought that we have about 30% of the West European population. But there have been some really worrying declines in curlew, on breeding curlew across much of the UK. And in some places, these declines have been pretty disastrous. The breeding population in Ireland has plummeted to around 150 pairs, and this is down from around 4,000 in the late 1980s. So this is a pretty staggering decline of 96%. And actually the Ireland population is now considered at risk of imminent extinction. For Scotland, data has been collected by volunteers actually conducting the breeding bird survey, and unfortunately has shown a 59% decline in the breeding population of curlew across Scotland. So on Shetland, as Robina mentioned previously, curlew do seem to be faring a lot better. And for me, I come from the south of England. We have fewer than 300 curlew pairs there. So it is a complete novelty and a real joy that I can sit at my desk and hear curlews as I'm sort of typing away working from home, which is incredible. And the fact that Shetland is a stronghold for curlew really should be celebrated. But we also do need to recognise that there has also been a decline in Shetland. With us, we are hoping to gather better quality data, but a survey in 2013 looked at 27 of the wader sites, the best wader sites that were identified in Shetland in 1993, and that showed an 11% decline. So that's still a significant and serious decline in the number of curlew pairs. So the reason for the decline in curlew is thought, well, it's mostly in the breeding population, and it's thought that it's due to breeding failure. So this means that you're not really getting the recruitment to the breeding population. Curlew need to produce at least one chick into adulthood every few years just to sort of maintain the population. So if the chicks aren't surviving, then that's what's causing this net loss. And a big threat to curlews is the loss and the degradation of suitable areas of breeding habitat. And a big factor in that is the intensification of agricultural use. So an example may be the intensification of grazing, so putting in more animals and increasing the amount of grazing that's happening in an area. And this will reduce the quality of the habitat, because curlews require a very sort of mosaic structure to fields. So they like areas of taller vegetation where they can sort of have cover for their nest to protect them from predators. And they also like open areas where they can keep an eye out for predators. So they really need like that mosaic structure, which just isn't achieved if the grazing is either too high or too low. So it's got to be just Goldilocks for them. Another example of agricultural intensification that's having a detrimental impact would be the draining of meadowlands and fields, and that reduces the wet areas. And these wet areas often attract lots of really high protein insects or invertebrates, and that's a really important food source for curlews, adults and chicks during the breeding season. Other factors do include afforestation. This is particularly on the mainland of Scotland, and also predation. So since it's mostly thought to be poor productivity or sort of the survival of chicks that's seen as a big factor in the decline of curlews, one of the conservation actions that Species on the Edge is looking to take for curlew and Shetland is to conduct breeding wader surveys so that we have a better understanding of breeding curlews and also of the condition of the sites where they're found or perhaps where they're not being found. And hopefully using this data to inform conservation action, which will include working really closely with landowners and sort of identifying opportunities for improvements in land management that can increase the quality of habitat for waders such as curlew. And this might be through sort of signposting and supporting landowners to funding opportunities like the Agri-Environment Climate Scheme and whatever comes after that as well. So management options inside of the Agri-Environment Climate Scheme include things like wader grazed grassland. And as I mentioned previously, it's interesting that it can be both the under and overgrazing of areas that can have an impact on waders. And a good example of that comes from RSPB reserves here in Shetland. So the Loch of Spiggy, I'm sure many people here in Shetland are very familiar with the Loch of Spiggy. And the Northwest Marshes is the area that you can see from Spiggy Hyde. And in recent years, there's been some improvements to the grazing regime there. So lots of the rank vegetation has been grazed down, and previously there was no space or available habitat for curlews to nest or feed there. But because of this increase in management and grazing, there's now a space opened up for them, and the number of pairs has increased from 3 pairs to 5 pairs. And I think that happened in the space of a season following the improvements in grazing. And that's just a really lovely example of how quickly changes in management can take effect. So I had a little event for curlews at Spiggy actually back in April. It was for World Curlew Day. This was on the 21st of April. And I learned all kinds of things about curlew for that. And I just want to share a little bit about that with you rather. And one of the really interesting things I found out about was just how much curlews have been celebrated in culture through the ages. And in fact, even going back to 1000 AD with a really famous poem, which is known as the Seafarer. So this makes mention, or the earliest mention of lots of different birds, and it's thought that it is the first mention of curlew as well. There is a little bit of sort of debate, but the experts are pretty sure it is a curlew. And the only reason there's some confusion is because it's actually the only surviving instance of the Old English word for curlew, which is really quite incredible, I think, which is hulapen, if I'm saying that correctly. So the Seafarer poem is found in the Exeter book, which has got a really interesting history. So it's described as UNESCO as one of the most important cultural artifacts of the world. And it's still found to this day in Exeter Cathedral Library. And it's really only the fact that this survived the Reformation in the time of Henry VIII that we have this reference, the earliest references to many birds and to the curlew, which is just quite incredible. The poem was actually unnamed, but it's been given the name The Seafarer in reference to its narrator, and we can only guess who the narrator is. He's at sea on a tempestuous sea. He could be a sailor or a fisherman, or he could be a monk. There was a great tradition in that age of setting sail to find isolation and become closer to God, but also to nature. And so there's just a little translation from the poem here, which I can read out if that's not too embarrassing. So it goes, "There I had nothing except the frowning sea, the ice-cold waves. Sometimes the swan's song I kept to myself as diversion, the cry of the gannet and the curlew's voice for the laughter of men, the seagulls singing for the drinking of mead. Storms beat the stony cliffs there, where the tern calls him with icy feathers. Very often the eagle screeches with wet feathers. No sheltering kinsfolk could comfort this impoverished spirit." And I just think this is really very beautiful, because clearly the seafarer, he's missing the kinship, the companionship of home and all of the pleasures of being on the shore. And so he's turning to the birds for his comfort and his inspiration. I just think that's very beautiful. It's also quite telling that it's the curlew's voice that is noted in the poem. And I just wanted to play a very short clip of the cry of the curlew, just to bring that music to our experience this evening. Let me know if it doesn't play.
Got you in there.
I'll just stop that there, but hopefully that is a sound that is familiar to lots of people in Shetland, and hopefully can become more familiar across the rest of Scotland too. Oh, that's going to play again. There we go. So from one noisy wader to another, we've got the lapwing. So again, unfortunately, the lapwing is another wader that's been in serious decline across Europe as well as much of the UK. So the current estimates are that the UK population has fallen by as much as 59% since 1967. And actually in 2009, the lapwing moved from the amber list to the red list of species of birds that are in most urgent need of our help, unfortunately. And here in Shetland, we've got data from the Breeding Bird Survey, which has unfortunately revealed a very similar story. We've had declines of about 37% in the period of 2002 to 2019. It's very similar story to the curlew. It's a story of a loss and degradation of habitat, and in large part this is due to changes in agricultural practices. Again, this includes draining of wet grasslands, reducing those feeding opportunities as we're losing those protein-rich invertebrates for chicks. We've also seen a mix away from mixed farm systems, and this means that, again, you're missing sort of the mosaic habitats that's required by waders. So for lapwing, they require some sort of high quality forage, which would be in unimproved meadows and grasslands, alongside some good nesting habitat, which would primarily be your arable areas. So the loss of those mixed systems has been a big blow. And then again, agricultural improvements, so things like the addition of fertilizers, which encourages the grass growth earlier in the season, which leads to earlier cutting dates, and also it enables more stock to come in and to have higher grazing intensities. So we're losing chicks and eggs, and it's also preventing lapwing possibly from being able to relay from when they do lose nests. And another change is the switch from spring to autumn sown crops, and this means that you don't have curlew on those sort of lovely bare fields in the spring, which are perfect for nesting, because of the switch to autumn sowing. The crops are already too high for them in March. They've just got nowhere to make their nest. I also mentioned for curlew, afforestation on the mainland can be an issue, and this is because it causes direct and indirect habitat loss. So the direct impact is that obviously planting trees just erases areas where lapwing could nest, but also there is a preference to nest further away from woodland because woodland can provide shelter to predators. So that's an indirect loss of habitat because you just get waders being pushed further and further away. And the combination of agricultural intensification and afforestation can also leave waders like lapwing more vulnerable to predation, which is another big blow to them. So it's again a similar story. It's thought to be chick survival that's a big factor in the decline of lapwings. And so again, the breeding wader surveys, we can go out and we can look at multiple species at the same time. So we can look at curlew and also at lapwing, and hopefully this can provide some important information about breeding waders and their habitats. And then we can use that to inform some of the conservation actions that we take forward. And again, this will involve working closely with landowners to sort of create these spaces for wildlife and waders in their crofts. Excuse me. I already mentioned Loch Spiggy. It's just a really nice example to reach out to. They've just been doing an incredible amount of work on Loch Spiggy, and the grazing regime there obviously has caused massive benefit for the curlew with an increase to 5 pairs, but they've also had breeding lapwing on the reserve for the first time this summer in many years. And another action that they have taken on the reserve is introducing a scrape, and it's already being used, or we've already seen the lapwing and the free chicks on that scrape, and they're just really incredible simple actions. Is putting a scrape into your system, which creates these feeding opportunities, these wet areas that attracts in the insects and just provides great feeding for breeding waders. So just another fantastic example of how quickly change can come. So one of the, I think is an interesting thing that I've found out about lapwing is that it's got the most vernacular or dialectal names of any bird. So the word lapwing is an Old English word which means to fly, to leap with a flicker, which I think is really beautiful and really descriptive of anyone who's seen some of the aerial displays of the lapwing. But it also has some less flattering names. So these include chewit, hornywinkle, flopwing, peewit, and of course here in Shetland it's thieves' knacket, which means thieves' imp. And continuing with this theme, the collective noun for lapwing is a deceit of lapwing, and there's a quote from Chaucer which says, the false lapwing are full of treachery. And these kind of slightly uncharitable names and associations for the lapwing are actually thought to be in reference to its kind of sly theatrical nature in trying to distract predators away from eggs. And in fact, it was the eggs that humans also once wanted. They were prized as a bit of a delicacy, and they'd be served in these elaborate baskets served with moss to sort of emphasize their speckled beauty, and they were sort of plundered well into the 20th century, and it was a very early cause of lapwing decline, in fact, until the introduction of the Lapwing Act in 1926, which banned the collection of eggs for food. And initially that caused considerable recoveries for lapwing until the more recent declines due to things like agricultural intensification. Just a quick sip. So moving on to Natalie's favourite, we've got the twite, and these are known as linties here in Shetland, which is possibly sort of homage to their reputation as the linnet of the north. So they did have fairly stable numbers in the UK in sort of the earlier part of the 20th century. But they've undergone really, really dramatic declines, actually. And they've been on the red list since 1996 because of these massive marked declines in the breeding population. And unfortunately, the story is not dissimilar in Shetland, and it's thought that there may now be as few as 500 breeding pairs here in Shetland. So the main reasons for the declines is thought to be in summer due to overgrazing, and also due to the improvement and the early cutting of hay, silage and road size. And basically what this does is reduce the amount of small seeds from wild plants, and this is what twite really rely on both as chicks and adults. And then in winter it's been the decline of arable cropping, particularly of neeps, which has produced sort of cover for twite through the winter, and also again the supply of weed seeds that's needed to sustain them through the winter. So for conservation action, again, it's surveying, but it'll be surveying of the winter population of twite to try and improve our knowledge and to inform some conservation actions. And again, working with landowners in order to try and improve the feeding habitat and breeding habitat for twite, but feeding especially, and again, really looking to increase that supply of small seeds that they really depend upon. And again, going back to RSPB, there was an action that was taken there again on the Northwest Marshes, which was the planting of a winter cover crop, which was a mixture of tatty and kell seeds amongst some others. And this was left unharvested and basically provided a source of seeds and also a cover for twite and other birds were seen in there, such as linnet, throughout the winter. It was eventually also discovered as a food source by a greyback shrike, otherwise known as a butcher bird, and also some sparrowhawks, but that just sort of goes to show the ripple effects of conservation action through ecosystems. So moving on from the twite to red-necked phalarope. Phalarope, as I'm sure most of you know, are pretty special in Shetland. And they're these absolutely gorgeous tiny waders, and they're only in Shetland for a very short window for breeding. And then actually they return to their wintering quarters out at sea. And some tracking studies have shown that amazingly, these birds that breed in Shetland are being found at winter as far away as the Eastern Pacific and off of Peru, for example. So phalaropes are sort of known for their reverse gender role. So it's the males that take on a lot of the parental care and they'll look after the nest and also the chicks. And they're sort of duller plumaged. It's the female that's got the striking plumage, as you can see in this photo, with the sort of the scarlet and white neck and the slate grey head. And it's the females that initiate pair bonding as well. Another association with phalaropes is this unusual feeding behaviour where they spin in a circle in shallow water, and it's thought that that creates a vortex that brings invertebrates and insects up to the surface, but you'll find that you probably haven't seen that in Shetland. And Kevin Kelly, the RSPB Reserves manager, who knows about everything there is to know about red-necked phalarope, will tell you that that's a good sign of really high quality habitat for them, that the feeding opportunities are so good that they don't actually have to revert to that behaviour, which is incredible. So Shetland is home to 80% of the UK population of breeding red-necked phalarope, and there's actually been recent increases in the population, and on RSPB reserves such as Fetler and Unts, this has been related to improvements in management, including improvements in grazing and cutting regimes, which have opened up the suitable breeding habitat. So red-necked phalarope are really looking for, oh, I've just had a notification, my internet connection is not very good. Can you all still hear me okay?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for letting me know. So I'll just go back to where I was. The preferred habitat for red-necked phalarope. So this is upland mires with areas of open water. So the open water is used for takeoff and landing, and also for breeding behaviour, for displaying. And then the surrounding emergent vegetation, which is usually sedges and bogbean, is used for feeding and for cover, with the mires being used for actual nesting as well. And it's actually often a lack of management of the mires that's a big issue, as the sort of grazing or cutting is reduced, the vegetation undergoes succession, and you lose those areas of open water that are really needed for phalarope. So at the Myers of Finney on the RSPB Reserve in Fetler, reintroducing grazing and cutting has opened up those pools and had immediate success. So Species on the Edge is really looking to support some of the amazing work that's already happening on the RSPB reserves in Shetland by surveying some of the off-reserve sites for phalarope and working with land managers to sort of try and make those improvements for increasing the areas of high quality breeding habitat for red-necked phalarope. And again, this is something that could be supported through something like the Agri-Environment Climate Scheme. So this is brilliant. The incredible journey of the red-necked phalarope from their wintering grounds in the Eastern Pacific all the way to Shetland has been an inspiration for this song cycle called One Small Bird, which is for schools, and it's the brainchild of Kate Stillitz and Julie Jarman, and it was actually performed here in Shetland at the Shetland Nature Festival in 2019, if anyone was lucky enough to see it. And I'm just going to play sort of 30 seconds or so of One Small Bird. This is a video from a performance at the Royal Albert Hall in London, and it had a choir and an orchestra and a jazz band, and yeah, it's just fantastic.
This is the story of a little bird. It flew much further than I'd ever heard. It took flight from the safety of an expert's hand. It flew from land to land to land. No one realised how far it flew until they discovered its journey to Peru. It did not travel by plane or boat. It flew by itself with its russet red throat.
So I do really encourage you to go and check out the rest of that. It's just a really lovely celebration of a remarkable bird.
It was the most beautiful music.
So moving on from red-necked phalarope, we'll go to the Shetland bumblebee, which many of you who are here in Shetland probably are quite familiar with. It's quite unmistakable. It's got this sort of Lucozade orange thorax and a really sort of sunshine yellow bottom. And it's this bright coloration as well as the genetics that sort of separate it out from the Moscarda bee, which you'll find on the Scottish mainland, sorry. So the Shetland bumblebee is a subspecies of the Moscarda bee, and it's endemic to Shetland and also to the Western Isles. So the Shetland bumblebee is known to occur throughout Shetland, but there's really sort of insufficient data to properly establish any population trends or a measure of its abundance, and without this we're kind of possibly missing some early warning signs of decline, and there is every chance that the Shetland bumblebee is unfortunately suffering in the same way as many bumblebees across the UK, and that it could be shrinking in its abundance and its population, and without us knowing, there's not a lot we can necessarily do just yet. And 2 bumblebee species have already become extinct in the UK in the 20th century, and we really don't want the very special Shetland bumblebee to go the same way. So to try and improve our knowledge of the Shetland bumblebee, Species on the Edge will be recruiting bee walker volunteers to carry out bee walks, roughly between March to October, to sort of be worked out. But Bee Walk is a long-term national recording scheme that's actually been set up by Bumblebee Conservation Trust, which is one of the partners for Species on the Edge. And the information that's collected from bee walks is just really important to see how bumblebee populations are changing over time, but also in reaction to changes in land use and also to climate change. So it can allow us to detect those early warning signs so that we can put management in place to act for those species and bring them back from the edge before it's too late. If anyone is interested in becoming a bee walker at all, I'll just do a shameless plug here. I will share my email address. It's on a slide at the end of this presentation, and you can drop me an email. We do actually have some online training from Bumblebee Conservation that's happening tomorrow afternoon, and I am able to share a link to anyone who's interested. And we're also hoping to have some in-person training on Bresser, hopefully the weekend of the 17th, 18th of June, which anyone is free to come along to. So I can also keep you up to date of any of that. But back to the Shetland bumblebee, just to say that bumblebees and other pollinators are really kind of an irrefutable example of the interdependence of humans with the natural world. So pollinators underpin the food webs that make up our natural world, and it is the natural world that sustains us in body and soul. We really need a thriving suite of diverse pollinators to grow our crops and to put food on the table. And the importance of bees has been reflected in lots of folklore and mythology, and especially in lots of superstitions. And if anyone does happen to know of any Shetland stories and superstitions about bumblebees, I'd be really interested to hear. It's already known that Shetland bumblebee really thrives with unimproved flower-rich meadows and hayfields, but also late-cut wildflower-rich roadside verges. And it's the loss of flower-rich habitat that's really having a major impact on Shetland bumblebee and other pollinators. So supporting crofters to maintain and to increase areas of flower-rich habitats in their crofts is a really important conservation action that can be taken for Shetland bumblebee to support them through their flying season, which is around May to October. But the potential contribution of roadside verges really shouldn't be understated. Just for context, there's around 238,000 hectares of roadside verges in the UK, compared to just 85,000 hectares of flower-rich grassland. And so something else that Species on the Edge will be looking at is to improve this, is to understand the status of roadside verges across Shetland and to gather data that can establish any potential roadside management improvements that will keep Shetland's roads safe, but also help plants and pollinators like the Shetland bumblebee to thrive. And we're also looking at developing a wildflower seed harvesting scheme as part of our activities to support the Shetland bumblebee. So the plantain leaf beetle comes next, and it is one of my favourites. I shouldn't be saying that, but it is. As you can see, there isn't a Shetland name for the plantain leaf beetle at the moment, and that's probably unsurprising, but it is to be continued. So you'll have to keep up to date with Species on the Edge to find out what the future holds for the name of the plantain leaf beetle. Sorry. So the plantain leaf beetle is a bit of a mystery. Superficially, it really closely resembles another species of leaf beetle, and that's the toadflax leaf beetle. The toadflax leaf beetle is much more widespread in the UK. It looks completely identical, but is genetically distinct. And just incidentally, leaf beetles are one of the largest groups of beetles. There's tens of thousands of species and over 280 species in the UK, and they tend to be closely associated with a particular food plant. So the plantain leaf beetle is thought to favour sea plantain, but it's actually also been seen foraging on things like wild thyme and sea pinks as well. So it's not just an exclusive to plantain. It's only known at a handful of locations, a few sites in Orkney, and it's only known from the Keen of Amar on Unst in Shetland. There was once a population recorded at Loch Etive, and Loch Etive was a really bizarre because it was such a different habitat. It was found on the salt marsh there, whereas in Shetland and Orkney we're finding it in these kind of wind-blasted rocky cliffs. So it was sort of speculated that they might be different species because of the difference, but again, genetic testing has shown they are in fact the same species. It's not actually been recorded at Loch Etive for a number of years, unfortunately. But we do know that we still have a population in Shetland. We might not know that much more about it, but we at least know it's there. So it is classified as nationally rare. It's found in fewer than 16 of the 10 kilometre squares that make up the UK grid. And it's on the IUCN Red List of endangered species as well. Most of everything we know about the plantain leaf beetle is complete speculation. So, for example, it's known that it has wing cases, but it's never been observed in flight. So one speculation is that it might previously have been windblown to Orkney and Shetland, but that once it became established in these really windblown locations, it lost either the ability or perhaps the enthusiasm for flight. So that's just one of the sort of myths of the plantain leaf beetle. But we are hoping to improve understanding of the plantain leaf beetle and to get some more information at least on its distribution and ecology. And this will include through sort of a citizen science sightings campaign. It's quite unclear what kind of conservation action we might be able to take for this species, but it is quite exciting that every time you go out to see it, you might be finding out something brand new. So the next species to talk about is endemic hawkweeds, and I've been rather ambitious here with some Latin names and things, but there is a point. So hawkweeds are plants that belong to the family Compostitae, and this includes daisies, dandelions, thistles, and marigolds, among others. But they're in the hawkweeds are in the genus Hieracium, but this is classically known as Hyraceum, which is a name that's derived from the Greek word for hawk, hyrax. And here's the point, because there's folklore that hawks used to drink the juice from hawkweeds in order to sharpen their eyesight. So lots of complicated pronunciation for a little interesting fact there. So the genus of Hieracium consists of a large number, really, of very superficially similar, they're actually called microspecies, and they all sort of closely resemble dandelions, at least to my untrained eye. So separating out all of these microspecies is something that is definitely best left to the experts, but luckily we do have some of those experts here in Shetland. So the species found here in Shetland are sort of further grouped into a number of different sections, and there's a particular section in Shetland which contains all endemic species to Shetland. This means that they're thought to have actually evolved here, which makes them rather exciting to botanists and taxonomists. And in fact, there's 18 species of hawkweeds that are thought to be endemic to the island. And the reason for this kind of mad number of microspecies is because they've got this really unusual reproductive mechanism. They actually produce their seed asexually. They don't need fertilization with pollen. So normally plant species viable seeds are only produced by the introduction of pollen to the ovum, and often also plants are self-sterile, which means that you always need pollen from another plant in order to produce viable seed, and this mixes up the gene pool at every generation, producing new combinations of genes, which is thought to be adaptive and better for a species. But the hawkweeds know better, and they don't do this. And the seedlings are all genetically identical to the parent, except for chance mutations. And basically, where these mutations are adaptive and they don't, sort of hinder the development of the hawkweed, they are kept, they're conserved, and they don't get diluted through the such shuffling, genetic shuffling of sexual reproduction. And this is what leads to all of this mad number of microspecies every time it causes a physical identifiable difference. So hawkweeds are found across many of the larger islands of Shetland. They're particularly abundant in the North and West mainland, Muckle Row, and also parts of Yell. They're completely absent in Fair Isle, Thula, Papistore, and many of the smaller islands as well. And they're also absent from the mainland south of Shanwick. Many of the populations that previously were recorded in the 19th century have unfortunately since been lost, and so it's very possible that hawkweeds were once much more widespread, but it's also very possible that some of the areas, particularly the smaller islands and more distant islands, were just never colonised. So another reason for the sort of limited distribution of hawkweeds is that they are only found where they're not routinely subjected to heavy grazing. So observations in the field suggest that the high latex content in hawkweeds means that they are quite unpalatable. So, for example, rabbits tend to avoid them, but sheep will graze on the flowering spike. So it's thought that this has got a lower latex content than the leaves at the bottom. What this means is that populations are unlikely to be directly destroyed by grazing, but because the flowering spike is being consumed, they are prevented from reproducing, and over time the existing plants will just grow old and die out, which can lead to extinction at those sites. So because of their sensitivity to grazing, hawkweeds are largely confined to locations that are inaccessible to sheep. And they're also found in hay meadows, where stock are regularly excluded during the summer. However, in these meadows, they tend to only be found in those areas that are not actually cut for hay or silage. So again, sort of squeezes them out a bit, and also where those meadows are being improved, the nutrients can be transferred to those parts of the field where hawkweeds are present, and that can lead to sort of stimulate the growth of grass, which can outcompete the hawkweeds. An improvement may also lead to earlier cutting and earlier aftermath grazing as well, which can have consequences for hawkweed seedlings. So species in Shetland, some are still relatively common and widespread, but others are represented by only one or a few plants at a few locations, and they're particularly vulnerable. and at least 2 species are known to have gone extinct in the wild. One was quarried away at Mavis Grind, and the other, it was thought to be due to overgrazing. But very fortunately, lots of efforts have been made to collect seeds and plants from the wild, and the Shetland Amenity Trust is doing an absolutely amazing job. They've got an incredible sort of library of seeds up at the tree nursery, and they're already propagating and bringing on hawkweeds for potential reintroduction, and that will be a really important conservation action for hawkweeds, as well as safeguarding them into the future by protecting sort of known and new sites from heavy grazing and development into the future as well. So again, working alongside landowners is going to be really important to encourage beneficial land management for hawkweeds, and to have changes to management that's more sympathetic, and that can include options through the Outgreen Environment schemes, like for species rich grass and management, for example. So our last species is the oyster plant, and it's so named because its fleshy grey leaves apparently taste quite strongly of oysters, but we would ask that you don't all sort of run out and start foraging for it, because it is nationally scarce in the UK. So this time it's found in fewer than 100 10-kilometre squares in the UK grid. So it has been recorded at 49 sites in Shetland since the first record way back in 1769, but it has been in long-term decline, and this has really accelerated in the latter half of the last century. So it's now only found at 12 sites in Shetland, and it can only really be said to be thriving at 2 of these sites. In many sites there may only be 1 plant or a small handful remaining. So oyster plant is typically found above the strand line on shingle and pebble beaches, and its seeds can be dispersed by the sea. And what this means is that oyster plant are able to colonise new beaches, although a lot of these colonies end up being quite peripheral and quite short-lived, so it's quite a dynamic species. This does make it vulnerable to climate change, so that natural dynamic nature of sort of being washed out at one beach and then arriving at the other because of increased storminess, this may very well be sort of upsetting that natural cycle, and potentially leading to a reduction in the number of colonies. But other threats do include overgrazing. So sheep will graze quite extensively on the foreshore in Shetland, and it does seem that they preferentially will select oyster plant for grazing. And the consequence of this is that heavy grazing will just eliminate oyster plant from the shoreline. And another threat would be accidental disturbance and destruction. This could be when you're extracting gravel and sand for domestic use, which is a legal right for crofters in Shetland, or it could be with the movement of heavy machinery to service and relocate salmon cages, for example. So on Fair Isle, there was an oyster plant population that was discovered in 1990, and by the end of the 1990s there was a fence in place to exclude sheep grazing, and also the local community agreed not to extract gravel from this site. And by 2001 there was 22 plants at the site, and half of those were large plants and flowering. So that's just a bit of a case study to kind of inspire potentially a bit of a campaign of awareness raising for the vulnerability of oyster plant to disturbance and to activities on the foreshore. And that's just one of the sort of actions that we can take for oyster plant. But again, the Shetland Amenity Trust have done some outstanding work in germinating oyster plant and bringing them on ready for transplanting out into the wild, and the reintroduction of oyster plant to boost existing colonies and maybe to be reintroduced to suitable sites that are found through surveying could be another really vital conservation action for oyster plants. So taking you through a few of the conservation actions as we've gone through the species that we hope to be taking in Shetland. And this slide is just a little summary of the work that we're hoping to undertake in Shetland. So one of the first things that I flagged up is working in partnership. So I've already mentioned that Species on the Edge is a partnership programme with Nature Scott, with Bumblebee Conservation Trust, for example. But we also really need to be working with local partners. So that might be with Shetland organisations like the RSPB Shetland Reserves, the Shetland Amenity Trust, the Shetland Community Wildlife Group, Geology Society, and the Shetland Amenity Trust, hopefully. And basically just working together means that we have more fun, we can save on resources and effort, we can avoid duplication, we can bring together new and different perspectives, skills and resources and knowledge. It's inspiring, it's energising, and hopefully together we can achieve more than the sum of our parts. We will also be sort of carrying out some of the staples of conservation. So we'll be bringing together existing and historic data alongside new data collected through species and habitat surveying in order to create a really thorough understanding of our target species and their needs, and how that we might be able to meet those needs through conservation action. And principally, as I've kept mentioning, working with land managers for that to increase the extent and the quality of habitat for these species. Working closely with SAP, they're doing an absolutely fantastic job at the tree nursery, bringing on oyster plant and hawkweeds already, as well as relic Shetland trees as well, of course. And yeah, we're hoping to work closely with them to carry on with bringing those species on and re-establishing some really resilient wild populations. We'll also be involving volunteers in as many ways as we can. There will be plenty of opportunities for traditional conservation volunteering, so things like carrying out breeding radar surveys and also bee walks to count bumblebees, and getting muddy with work parties carrying out practical conservation action. But we also do want to try and do things a bit differently, and there are so many ways that people can be involved in Species on the Edge as individuals, but also as communities. So perhaps someone's a keen photographer and they can share their photos with us. They might have a repository of Shetland natural history knowledge and folklore to share, campaigning skills that can be put to use. They might be very savvy on social media, writing articles, helping with events. And then communities, potentially could be adopting roadside verges or becoming champions of their local oyster plant sites, like has happened on Fair Isle. And of course, we also want to give back to people. We want to provide opportunities to learn new skills, to try something different, make new friends, and to gain the satisfaction of being part of conservation action in Shetland. I'll just say a few words about the community engagement strand of Species on the Edge, which is really where I'm taking in the lead. And we've got 3 different themes for Species on the Edge. The first of which is the leading edge. The national activity for this is the youth panel. So we're looking to recruit at least 2 young people aged 16 to 25, and they'll be drawn from each programme area to represent their area at a national panel. It's hoped that this will provide a voice and a platform for young people, create a network of peers, and empower young people to bring about the change that they want to see for their nature and their communities. And then there's like a local component to this activity, which will be a young conservation group. And this group will work closely with the National Youth Panel, who will come up with the ideas that this group will then put into practice on the ground. Voices from the Edge is the second strand, and it's looking to give a real participatory role to communities to shape conservation action and hopefully to create a real genuine legacy to the programme. So Voices from the Edge will comprise a programme of sort of discussion events or community conversations, and this is happening across all the programme areas, including here in Shetland. As it will sort of give a voice to people's experience and values, and strengthen their connections to each other and to nature and the environment. And we would hope to capture some of those stories and voices and connections in a storybook in the sort of Lost World style. The final theme is nature for all. So feeling connected to nature can provide a host of physical and mental health benefits. It's good for mind, body and soul. Connection to nature can follow several different pathways, as you can see here. So it involves engaging the senses and emotions, being compassionate and finding meaning and beauty in nature. You will notice actually that knowledge isn't one of the 5 pathways to nature connection. So going out in nature and reeling off a list of scientific names of all the species you see is one way of experiencing nature and taking solace in nature, but it's by far not the only way. So Nature for All will be looking at doing a community arts project that will look to explore these pathways to nature connectedness with the appreciation and creation of art linked to nature as one way to bring people closer to nature and to improve their well-being. Nature for All is also looking to address sort of challenges and barriers that people have with connecting to nature. Access to nature can be limited for all kinds of reasons, like disability, deprivation and discrimination. So Nature for All will be looking to explore the communities, their own interests, expertise and opportunities, and develop a kind of multi-sensory activity which will incorporate sort of vision and sound and other creative experiences as a way perhaps to address physical and other barriers and find a new way of approaching and connecting to nature, and trying to work with people who maybe haven't been involved in these kinds of programs before because they think it's not for them, and trying to make opportunities as inclusive as possible. So you might be pleased to hear that that's it for me. Thank you very much for having me along this evening to share a little bit about Species on the Edge with you today. It's definitely still early days, but we do hope that the programme can become a powerful, positive platform for people to explore and connect with nature, to grow and develop as individuals and communities, and to take action for target species. I've put up some contact details here for myself and for Tom, the project officer, in case you wanted to get in touch at a later date, find out more about the project and ways to get involved. And I've just also put up a few dates of what we've got coming up, which includes the online training tomorrow. And again, I can share that link with anyone who's interested. That's for bumblebee identification. And then our potential one-to-one face-to-face training for bees on Vesa, hopefully the 17th, 18th of June. Breeding radar surveys to 24th or 25th of June, and then activities throughout the summer, including at Untsfest. So hopefully see some of you there. And thank you very much again. And does anyone have any questions?